Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on what could be considered the smallest experimental aircraft carrier of the Second World War. And this ship here comes from the German Luftwaffe instead of the German Navy. And that ship is the German Luftwaffe seaplane launcher and recovery vessel known as the Greif from 1937. The Greif was an experimental German seaplane carrier and recovery vessel, also known as a seaplane launcher, known as a Flugschifferungsschiff in German, which was a type of air traffic control seaplane launcher, seaplane recovery, and salvage vessel that was developed between 1936 and 1937. The Greif weighed just 890 tons. Now, what made the Greif stand out is that she was an experimental warship at first, before eventually being converted into a standard seaplane recovery vessel later on in 1943. Now, in the 1930s, the Germans were watching the British as they were developing their own aircraft carriers. Britain had begun developing aircraft carriers at the end of World War I, and the Germans wanted to build their own aircraft carriers. So, in the mid to late 1930s, they began to experiment using some of their existing vessels. The first aircraft carrying warships used by the Germans were large catapult ships, which were used by the German Luftwaffe to launch large seaplanes. Later on, in 1936, the Germans constructed the Greif, which was built by the German Oderwerken in Stettin, which was a German shipbuilding company based in the city of Stettin, which is now part of Poland. The ship weighed 890 tons. She had a speed of 18.7 knots, a crew of 56 men and 7 officers, and she had a main armament of 3 20mm Flak 30 anti-aircraft autocannons. Now, the Greif was originally meant to be a seaplane carrier and recovery vessel, but in 1937, she was converted to an experimental light aircraft carrier type warship. Her entire midsection and stern section was fitted with a long flight deck capable of carrying at least 2 planes, 2 light aircraft, and she was used to launch several of Germany's early reconnaissance aircraft, most notably, for example, the Fiesler 156, also known as the Stork, which was a German reconnaissance aircraft that was famously used during World War II by the Luftwaffe. The Greif could carry at least 2 planes. These planes could both take off and land using her rear carrier deck. The Germans would continue experimenting with the Greif until at least 1943. In 1943, the Germans had no use for the German Navy and many of the ships in the Luftwaffe naval detachment, and so the Greif was converted back into her original form as a seaplane launcher, seaplane recovery vessel used by the Luftwaffe until the end of World War II. Now, the Greif is technically the smallest aircraft carrier warship to be used in the Second World War, even though she was just an experimental vessel at first, before being reconfigured into her original configuration as a seaplane launcher and recovery vessel. Now, she only weighed 890 tons, which makes her 1/10 the size of the smallest escort carriers. The US and British navies used a large number of escort carriers. These were aircraft carriers that were converted from existing light cruisers, heavy cruisers, or in some cases, cargo vessels and oil tankers. And these escort carriers usually weighed about 8,000 to 10,000 tons. Greif weighed less than 1,000 tons. She was definitely much lighter than any of the fleet carriers that were in existence. For example, the German aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin, which weighed over 50,000 tons, or the American carrier at the start of the war, the USS Lexington, which weighed over 38,000 tons. So the Greif, being an experimental vessel, she was technically the smallest aircraft carrier in history, technically. She wasn't an official aircraft carrier. She was never used to launch any attack warplanes during the Second World War, but she was used as an experimental testbed for future German aircraft carriers. In fact, the Germans would use their technical data gained from using the Greif to develop their first true aircraft carrier, the Graf Zeppelin, and their second aircraft carrier, the Wesser. the Wesser being a former German heavy cruiser converted into a light aircraft carrier in 1942-1943. So there you have it, the Greif, one of the smallest, if not the smallest, experimental aircraft carrier type warship to be used in the Second World War. Now her story doesn't end there. In 1943, she was converted back into her original configuration as a seaplane carrier and recovery vessel, serving until 1945. After 1945 and after World War II, she was handed over to the French Navy, or the Marine Nationale, and she was renamed the Marcel Le Bihan. In French service, she served as a reconnaissance vessel for the French Navy until the year 1990. In 1990, she was finally scuttled off the coast of Africa. That is basically the end of the history of one of the smallest, if not the smallest, aircraft carrier type warship to be used by any navy in the Second World War, and maybe even history. I don't see any aircraft carrier type warship being any smaller than this vessel here. But for at least 6 or 7 years, she served the German Luftwaffe as an experimental testbed aircraft carrier. So what do you all think of this? The German experimental warship, the Greif from 1937? Please tell me in the comments section below. Until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.